Oseo.
Oseo.
Good, that's a Cherokee greeting. Konnichiwa. It's a Japanese greeting. And today I'm starting with a theme. I'm trying to say it in Japanese. Nikkei o haru, meaning to do honor to artists and poets, women poets and artists of Japan and beyond. So I want to start out right away in mentioning some other women. First of all, Courtney Stapleton, who just visited us from Hawaii and has gone back to Hawaii with one of my drawings. She and I worked on a mural for the Japanese play Momotaro-san when she was a young student. And next, Carol Siegel, an artist of Encinitas, who we met today, very incidentally. And Melanie, Little Egypt, and she is the author of children's books there. And also Ms. Kazo Koreyabayashi, the photojournalist that I presented a couple of weeks ago. And these are representative, meaning women everywhere. And what I'm featuring today most particularly is this makimono. That's the name of this scroll painting. And the artist painter of this is Ema Saiko. Ema being her surname in Japanese custom. And this painting is quite remarkable, exquisite, and everything there. And I'm going to point out, first of all, over there, if your camera go over there, this is a certificate for this. This painting has been registered at the House of Taisho in Tokyo as important cultural property, and has given the tentative date for the painting itself as 1850. That's still within the feudal period, which ended in 1868, so 1850, and Saiko would have been in her early 60s when she painted this. So this would be a very mature painting. She started painting when she was 9 years old, and then eventually, when she had this kind of talent, and that she, her father was a medical doctor of Dutch scholarship, Dutch learning there. And this era that she lived in, Tokugawa, called in Japan, is very much like the Victorian age in England, almost coincide like that. And eventually moving into the Edwardian period or the Meiji period in Japan. So the corsets of Victorian women can be transferred to moral or mental corsets on women in Japan. Very, very strict in that way. So Saiko had a number of teachers that she has learned from there. And this painting ought to be in Japan. I don't know how that it's got out. But the interesting thing is how I procured this painting. It was by a very chance meeting with a Russian couple in Encinitas, where we were today. And their sister had passed away, and she had this painting. Now the interesting thing about it was, I don't know how long, 100 more years ago, the Japanese had what I kind of call a love affair with the Russians. Maybe they were the first. Japan was isolated for almost 300 years, and when they opened up, they seemed to embrace the Russians for some reason. And but it soured because there was a war, the Russo-Japanese War, as they called, and that soured the relationship. But the connection of a Russian woman with Japan and its art and this scroll. And I would wish that this painting could be returned to Japan into the Emashiro collection where it belongs. So all of that's very interesting there, because anybody who's connected with us. Now, in her time, stemming from the end of the 18th into the 19th century, she's pretty well known. There are, a fair group of women artists. They're in a group that's called Nanga, means Southern Chinese painting, and they do everything to emulate Chinese and so forth. And they're also called bunjin in Japanese, referring to this entire style of Chinese painting. Now, Chinese culture, came in, centuries before and became the real culturing agent, I guess I could call, for people who have the class, to learn Chinese and its calligraphy and its culture. And so that had been going on. So anybody who was, we'll call it in our term, upward and mobile, they would be definitely studying Chinese and learning Chinese there. And as the feudal age continued to about, the last 80 years of that period, things, seemed to get a little bit more loose. Like the father of Saiko, he was not of the samurai class, but you kind of have an uprising class of people who would encourage their daughters to be educated. So women are still held, pretty much in a moral corset. And so as long as they went along that way, although these women bujin artists were not all straight-laced and conformative, even at that, there were women who were irregular because as the evolution of the social situation was going, women were coming from different levels of society. So to give you an idea, I'm really interested in seeing, over the centuries, the thread of women and their culture. So women artists in Japan were there and very much a part of it, and certainly had patrons, even as the size of this painting would say. It would have to be in a very large house in that way. So that's one of my interests in viewing, this thread of women. Later, like in 1910, 1911, there was in Japan, stemming from England and Boston, the Blue Stocking Society in Japan. Now this era that Saiko's in is not a precursor to that, but once you have the Blue Stocking people in the 1910s and things like that, they could look back. You could look back into these women who did carry on a woman's culture in that way. So everything in this culture that she, the bunjin, is Chinese. And Chinese also, we could just look down here, that this is a definitely Chinese teapot and teacup. This was, for the sencha tea. And this very much was, the main tea for the bunjin, like that. And we'll just, settle with that right there. And now I'm going to read a piece from Saiko's journal. As I reached 50, I began to understand the mistakes of the past. As the years slowly pass, they have gone against my ambition. Cranes are tall, ducks are short. It is not men who have made them thus. Fish leap, hawks soar. All follow the course of nature. My intentions have melted like the snow in the springtime. Old friends have vanished like the stars in the morning brightness. In the end, there is no use of Taoist practices for longevity. I only love to paint bamboo, its greenness reflected on my garment. So then we can refer here, this is a modeling the garment, that I have it here as resemblance, as if that it is Saiko. She's wearing a light green kimono and an obi, and she really looks of the kind of distinction that I imagine that would definitely show on Saiko. So that's the reason that I have that here. Now I got this painting maybe 25, 30 years ago, like that. And we have a musical friend, Nishi, from Japan, who was also educated in in China, like that. So he was he recognized this. He recognized this, had no trouble with recognizing that. And because he studied literature in China, I asked him if he could read this, the calligraphy. So she was very famous, he knew that, for her calligraphy and her poems there. So one of her teachers who she learned, this Chinese calligraphy from is the way, Kanji, we'll refer to it, he was also famous, Ray Sanyo. And he was a Confucian scholar, a historian, a poet, and also authored one of the Japanese history textbooks that was very popular at that time. So the relationship between Saiko and Sanyo is very much a part of the story that makes her very famous in Japan, even to now there. And so I'll just read a short poem of his to convey this sense of the relationship. I don't know how to call it, it's not unrequited, but they evidently were in love with each other, and given the period of time that they lived in, her father wouldn't give permission for marriage. They wanted to get married, so she remained unmarried, or he himself later married. And this is his poem, is reflecting about her. He's called it Farewell Talk with Saiko by a Rainy Window. A parting meal, low lamp, stay and enjoy it a bit longer. New mud on the road home. Better wait till it dries. On peaks across the river, clouds only now dispersing. Strings and songs in the house next door, just beginning to fade in the night. The third month of this spring, my guest lingers on, though last night's rain heartlessly scattered the cherry flowers. From here you go to Mino, not a long way away, though growing old, I know how hard it is to meet now and then. Mino is the province that she lived in, and he's in Kyoto, where a lot of these records have come from. So because of their relationship has added to fame and the notoriety of her as a woman among women Chinese style painting and culture. She had very many women students also, who had learned from her. So these are very notable people, and again, that's why this painting would do well in Japan, because only somebody who is really knowledgeable can really know how to appreciate what she has achieved in her lifetime of painting in this style of the bamboo. And while I don't have a reading for the exact calligraphy here, Nishi looked at it for a long time, and he just said he was sorry that he could not give me a reading for it. But on another painting that's very similar to this, that she has done, I don't know, just 2 or 3 years later, this reading has been translated. I have filled this scroll with misty clouds of ink, azure dragons halted by the wall of rocks, snake forth their claws in the lower foreground, seeming to drink the inkstone till it is dry. End of the quote there. So all of this to give the impression of that period, almost like we say a greenhouse time where the culture was able to thrive until 1868 was, abrupt end to that period. And then artists such as her, she died now in 1861, so she did not see the end of that period. But most people who had patrons that period, suddenly the whole social structure and its economy has been changed. So all of a sudden there is no more patrons. Not only that, but in the new era, it seems strange, but brush painting was also not exactly banned, but don't do it kind of thing here. Now, here in my display, I wanted to point out this doll here that I have, and what she's carrying in a red cover is a samisen. The samisen is not exclusively a woman's instrument, but very favored by women, and that I've even had a recording of a woman doing a poetry form with the samisen. And usually if we go to Japanese festivals, there will be women playing the samisen. So that's why that I have this particular one there. Over here, you can go to this exhibit here. First of all, there's a Chinese vase, and this has been made from jade, neophyte jade. I think it's rather old. So to accompany this theme of Chinese and Japanese women. And from that there is the fan there with a painting of a Japanese woman, and it's hard to see, but she's holding in her hand a thistle flower, purple thistle flower, a zami. And this is rather a signal or saying either I am unmarried, or we want to put it in this guise, I am a woman who is single. And so that's the way that that is. And we go up above that here in the shape of a fan, ogi, like that. There is a very artful carving of a kanji letter. So I sent this by way of Vivian to Ms. Gazo, and I want to thank her for the reading. Dozo arigato, and it is hana, which is flower. And on the reverse side, written in kanji, is the sobriquet of the carver, and that is basically Tsujimoto, which is expert letter carving artist, basically, is what it's saying. And that there below it, I put a watercolor that is just recently painted by Vivian Olds for her harvest flower. Now this character here, if we look down here, I have this tea bowl. And I think that this tea bowl would be, favored by a woman. And the painting on the tea bowl there's two flowers next to each other coming out of the grass or the foliage. This character up here is actually derived from that very illustration, and these two dashes on the top are actually what's left of the two flowers, and the remaining part is kusa, like the grass or the ground that it has come out of. So I put those two together. And again, women were not excluded from the tea ceremony. The difference is the Japanese tea using the bowls using powdered tea, where the Chinese tea here in the teapot is steeping the tea leaves, and in particular in Japan was this kind of tea in particular there. And then I have the Chinese pot here with a semblance of bamboo in it. So before I get too far, let me read this poem from down here, Women Poets of Japan. And this is to go with the flower part that I just presented to you. And this poem is by Shindo Chie. And she lived in the 20th century. I mean, like right now, she would be 100 years old. if she has lived this long. And very interesting, she attended an academy in Tokyo, something that's like the Athénée Franciosa, something like that. In other words, she was a student of French poets in Japan. So that's very interesting. And this is her poem I've selected to accompany that part of the display entirely, including the tea-bowl. Space. Who could know in advance the slight curve of the line of the flower about to bloom in the midst of the sky, taking its position in the midst of abundant time? Who could decide in advance the form and the subtle color of the flower about to open to its extremity, devoting itself to abundant golden time? Breezes play, only sunlight knows it is being robbed. The blue in the sky inclines to the limits of its flow. The sky sways as the petals wave. So again, I just want to sort of highlight my interest, in this culture because it's an island culture, and its history, really started around 2,000 or 1,500 years ago, and they recorded enough of their history early on, 7th, 8th century. They began, recording, because once they had the Chinese characters, they began to make their own Genesis, their mythology, and a succession of the empresses and emperors. Again, up to maybe the 8th century, all of the sovereigns were women. There was not a matriarchy because they didn't have that kind of lineage, but in that way. And then, as what's called the patriarchal revolt, seems like around the 8th century, men became more and more important, and eventually under the military, starting about the 13th century, women's part in the society seemed to become far more constricted, for a while. Although there's always a thread coming through of women's culture in this way that I am presenting here. So that's a main part that I'm interested in here. But I'd love to find Mary Oliver in these things. And this is a Mary Oliver poem from White Pine. And my sense of her poem, to me, is the feeling of Saiko. Like she could have thought this way. Fall. The black oaks fling their bronze fruit into all the pockets of the earth. Pop, pop. They knock against the thresholds, the roof, the sidewalk, fill the eaves, the bottom line of the old gold song of the almost finished year. What is spring? All that tender green stuff compared to this falling of tiny oak trees out of the oak trees, then the clouds gathering thick along the west, then advancing, then closing over, breaking open, the silence, then the rain, dashing its silver seeds against the house. And I see it all, the yearning, then the blunt and paunchy flight, then the sweet, dark falling. Domo arigato.